That slap wasn't the moment I lost face. It was the exact second a family empire began to fracture under the crystal lights and a string quartet. The arrogant heir thought he had just publicly humbled an executive. He had no idea I had already prepared every email, timeline, and trap he would blindly walk into. He didn't bruise my pride that night. He simply activated a cold, clean, structured ruin for his entire legacy. My name is Stella Baker. At 37 years old, I serve as the Executive Director of Contract Integrity at Blackwell Urban Systems. To the general public, our company name might seem like just another corporate entity on a billboard, but in the American Midwest, we are the invisible hand shaping the cities. We hold the reins on massive urban infrastructure projects and transit upgrades. My role is highly specific and chronically unappreciated. I am the fortress wall standing between reckless corporate ambition and catastrophic federal indictments. My daily existence is devoted to keeping promises grounded, budgets tethered to reality, and contracts flawlessly clean. The Spring Gala at Marlowe House in Ashford was designed to be a lavish celebration of our upcoming third quarter initiatives. The grand ballroom was a masterpiece of gilded architecture, bathed in the golden, fractured light of crystal chandeliers. The soft, sweeping notes of a live string quartet drifted through the air, layering over the low, confident hum of power brokers negotiating over flutes of expensive champagne. I stood near the towering arched windows that overlooked the manicured gardens, engaged in a highly sensitive conversation with Dana Whitmore. Dana was the lead representative for the Briar Transit Renewal Authority. We were standing on the precipice of renewing a strategic contract worth tens of millions of dollars. It was a delicate, high-stakes dance of corporate diplomacy. Dana needed concrete reassurances that Blackwell's operational capacity could handle the massive upcoming expansion without the budget bleeding over into unauthorized territories. We have tightened the compliance parameters on the new bid. Dana, I said, keeping my voice level and calm against the ambient noise of the crowded ballroom. The overages you saw in the last cycle were thoroughly audited and sealed. The new framework we built guarantees a hard cap on procurement costs. There will be zero surprises. Dana took a slow, thoughtful sip of her drink, her sharp eyes studying my face. She trusted my word, but she was harboring a growing, justified distrust of my company's upper management. Before Dana could offer a reply, the atmosphere in our immediate vicinity drastically shifted. Wyatt Halverson approached us. Wyatt was the son of our chief executive officer, Grant Halverson. He carried himself with the unearned, suffocating arrogance of a young man who had never been told the word for weeks. A quiet, toxic pressure had been steadily building between us. I had systematically intercepted and blocked a half-dozen of his erratic, highly irregular proposals. Wyatt possessed the reckless impatience of inherited power, genuinely believing that standard operating procedures were merely suggestions meant for employees who did not share his last name. Tonight, his face was flushed with anger, his jaw tight with accumulated irritation from my constant refusal to bend the rules for him. He did not offer a professional greeting. He did not wait for a pause in the conversation. He simply inserted his physical presence into the space between Dana and me, an immediate and intentional violation of professional courtesy. "Stella," Wyatt said, his voice carrying a jagged, demanding edge that cut right through the polite murmur of the nearby guests. "I need you to open the internal bidding file for the Cedar Vale project right now. You are going to fix some numbers for me tonight. The oversight board needs to see a much more aggressive margin tomorrow morning." Dana stiffened, her eyes darting between the two of us. I kept my posture perfectly still, my expression betraying nothing. To demand fraudulent adjustments to an internal bid in front of a key client was not just arrogant, it was an act of profound, staggering stupidity. "Wyatt," I replied, my tone deliberately flat, entirely devoid of the deference he so desperately craved. "This is neither the time nor the place for this discussion. Furthermore, the internal audit is locked. We do not adjust finalized projections. I am telling you to unlock the file," he demanded, stepping closer, aggressively invading my personal space. The scent of expensive scotch and raw entitlement rolled off him in waves. The projections look weak. I need them to look attractive for the board. I did not break eye contact. I did not take a step back. I lowered my voice, delivering my words with the cold precision of a surgical blade. Those numbers reflect our actual, verifiable operational capacity. Numbers are not props to perform for investors. Wyatt, they are legal boundaries. Something dark and violent snapped in his eyes. It was the absolute, unyielding denial from a subordinate that pushed him over the edge. He could not handle the boundary I had drawn, and he absolutely could not handle being denied in front of an audience. Wyatt raised his right hand and struck me across the face. It was not a closed-fist blow meant to knock me unconscious or break a bone. It was an open-handed slap, sharp, cracking, and incredibly loud. It was a gesture designed entirely for maximum humiliation. The physical sting was immediate, a sudden, blinding rush of heat blossoming across my left cheek. But the physical pain was utterly insignificant compared to the intent behind the motion. It was a public execution of my professional authority. It was his way of marking his territory, proving to everyone present that he could physically discipline an executive director in a room full of millionaires and face absolutely zero consequences. The effect on the grand ballroom was instantaneous and catastrophic. The low hum of sophisticated conversation vanished, sucked out of the enormous room in a single, collective gasp. The string quartet faltered abruptly, a violinist scraping a harsh, discordant note before the music died completely. A heavy, suffocating silence crashed down on us. I felt the eyes of over 200 powerful people burning into my skin. Some guests physically recoiled, turning their faces away in secondhand horror and embarrassment. Others froze in place, staring in raw, unadulterated shock. Through the parting crowd, my gaze locked onto the main podium at the far end of the room. Grant Halverson stood there, the chief executive officer, the father. He had a clear, unobstructed view of the entire altercation. I saw the slight parting of his lips, the sudden tightening of his grip on the mahogany wood of the stand. He saw his son assault one of his top executives in plain view of his most important clients. Grant did not move. He did not step forward to intervene. He simply stood there and watched. In that crystalline moment of absolute, dead silence, the universe demanded a reaction from me. The standard social script called for tears, a shouted accusation, a dramatic exit, or perhaps a panicked retreat to the restroom. The script demanded that I crumble, thereby validating Wyatt's display of dominance. I absolutely refused to read his script. I did not bring a hand up to touch my burning cheek. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or attempt to strike him back. I drew a slow, perfectly measured breath, grounding myself in the physical reality of the marble floor beneath my heels. I looked at Wyatt. I gave him one singular, empty look. It was a look that completely stripped him of his executive title, his family name, and his perceived power. I looked at him not as a dangerous threat, but as a critical error in a spreadsheet that I was about to delete. Then, I calmly turned my head back to Dana Whitmore. She was pale, her mouth slightly open in shock, her glass trembling slightly in her hand. As I was saying, "Dana," I kept my voice perfectly steady, ensuring every single syllable was clear and resonant in the dead quiet of the room. The framework guarantees a hard cap. I will have my office send you the finalized compliance report on Monday morning. Enjoy the rest of your evening. I gave her a polite, practiced nod. Without glancing back at Wyatt or acknowledging the paralyzed crowd, I turned and walked toward the grand exit. My pace was deliberate, measured, and completely unhurried. I listened to the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels against the floor, the only sound echoing in the cavernous space. I felt the heat radiating from my face, a violent contrast to the absolute ice running through my veins. I pushed through the heavy oak doors, crossed the opulent, deserted lobby, and pressed the button for the elevator. The polished metal doors slid open. I stepped inside and turned around, watching the luxurious lobby disappear as the doors slid shut with a soft, definitive click. Alone in the gleaming steel box, I finally allowed myself to exhale. I reached up and lightly touched my cheek. It was hot, sensitive, and throbbing, a physical manifestation of a profound professional rupture. But as the elevator began its descent to the parking garage, a completely different sensation washed over me. It was not despair, it was not fear, it was cold, crystalline clarity. Wyatt thought he had just won. He thought he had shattered my defiance and put me in my place. What he did not understand, what no one in that silent ballroom understood, was that this precise scenario had already been mapped out in my mind. When you work for a corporate dynasty that believes itself to be untouchable, you do not simply hope for their good behavior, you build a vault of their sins. I knew Wyatt was volatile. I knew his incompetence was matched only by his aggressive insecurity. I had anticipated that eventually, his frustration would bypass hidden professional sabotage and spill over into overt, undeniable self-destruction. This was not the first time I had prepared for the possibility that Wyatt Halverson would publicly dismantle his own life. I had been quietly, methodically archiving his toxic footprint for months. Every bypassed protocol, every deleted warning, every coerced vendor approval, it was all there, locked away in a secure secondary drive, waiting for the exact moment he pushed too far. Tonight, he did not just push. He leaped over the edge with his eyes closed. The elevator arrived at the ground floor with a soft chime. I adjusted my posture, smoothing the fabric of my dress, feeling my spine align like steel. Gah. The sting on my face was already transforming from a mark of humiliation into a powerful catalyst. Wyatt thought the slap was the end of the conversation. He had absolutely no idea that he had just fired the starting gun on a war he could not possibly win. I stepped out into the cool night air, fully prepared to initiate the ruin of the Halverson Empire. I did not ascend to the executive suite by smiling at the right people, attending the right charity dinners, or relying on a stroke of incredible luck. Corporate power, real corporate power, is never handed to you because you are pleasant. It is surrendered to you because you become the only person capable of holding the ceiling up when the pillars start to crack. 7 years ago, Blackwell Urban Systems was a company on the absolute brink of total collapse. The board had authorized a phase of hyper-aggressive expansion across the Midwest, gobbling up municipal contracts we simply did not have the internal infrastructure to support. We were bleeding capital, facing a mountain of regulatory fines, and staring down the barrel of multiple breach of contract lawsuits. They brought me in to stop the bleeding. Over those 7 years, I did not just patch the holes. I tore the company down to its studs and rebuilt the entire contract control framework from scratch. I became the invisible architect of our survival. While the sales division sold municipal dreams, I was the one who kept those massive, sprawling projects from sliding off the rails. I spent countless nights rewriting toxic files, dragging doomed negotiations back from the edge of the abyss, and translating the delusional sky-high commitments made by our acquisitions team into legally viable, physically possible realities. I built a system of checks and balances so rigorous that our legal liability dropped by 90% within my first 3 years. I earned my authority through the brutal, unglamorous work of saying no to bad ideas and forcing accountability onto a culture that historically despised it. Then, Grant Halverson decided it was time to introduce the Crown Prince to the kingdom. Wyatt Halverson was 26 years old when his father parachuted him into the C-suite. He arrived with the freshly minted, entirely fabricated title of Executive Vice President of Growth. Anyone with a passing knowledge of his background knew the truth. His actual resume consisted of a string of spectacularly failed boutique investment ventures, all quietly bailed out by family money and cleverly disguised behind a smokescreen of flashy, disruptive corporate jargon. He had never managed a construction site. He had never negotiated a union dispute. He had never sat across from a federal auditor. Yet, on his very first week at Blackwell, he was given a corner office that dwarfed the workspaces of veteran directors who had spent 2 decades actually building the company's wealth. Wyatt immediately began to operate under a singular, toxic delusion. He behaved as though the name Halverson printed on his business card was the only empirical proof of competence he would ever need. The most dangerous thing about Wyatt was not that he was stupid. If he had been a complete idiot, he would have been easy to isolate and manage. But Wyatt was sharp in all the wrong ways. He possessed a superficial but highly effective intelligence. He knew how to read a spreadsheet. He knew exactly how to tailor his vocabulary to mesmerize a room full of venture capitalists. He understood the intoxicating magnetic effect of projecting absolute, unshakable confidence. He could sell a vision. What he fundamentally lacked was any comprehension of the boundary line between aggressive financial modeling and objective, physical reality. I recognized his operating pattern within his first month on the floor. Wyatt had a pathological need to bend the universe to his immediate desires. In his mind, numbers were supposed to look better than the actual field reports dictated. Deadlines were supposed to be faster than our physical engineering capacity allowed. And most importantly, when those fabricated timelines inevitably shattered and the inflated budgets collapsed, the responsibility was always supposed to land squarely on the shoulders of someone else. He viewed my compliance framework not as a safety mechanism, but as a personal insult to his authority. He began treating our established vetting protocols like minor inconveniences to be steamrolled. He would demand that supply chain estimates be slashed by 20% just to make a quarterly projection look more aggressive. He would try to fast-track municipal bids without securing the required environmental impact studies, assuming we could simply pay the fines later and bury the cost in the margins. Every single time Wyatt attempted to jump the fence, I was there to catch him. I became the silent, relentless custodian of his recklessness. When he submitted a dangerously altered budget draft, I would quietly intercept it, recalculate the actual margins, and firmly attach the necessary compliance warnings. When he tried to force a legally dubious vendor agreement through the system, I would systematically pull the risk review department into the email chain at the exact right moment, effectively neutralizing his maneuver before he could drive the company off a cliff. I did not yell. I did not complain to human resources. I simply built an invisible, impenetrable cage of procedure around him. Naturally, this infuriated him. But my ultimate realization regarding the true threat to my career did not come from Wyatt's tantrums. It came from the man sitting in the absolute center of power. Grant Halverson was fully aware that his son was a walking liability. As the chief executive officer, it was his fiduciary duty to protect the firm from internal threats. Instead, he chose the path of a cowardly father. Rather than publicly reprimanding Wyatt or stripping him of his unearned authority, Grant opted for a strategy of quiet, suffocating complicity. He would occasionally call me into his massive, wood-paneled office late in the evening. He would pour 2 glasses of sparkling water, sit back in his leather chair, and offer me a tired, conspiratorial smile. "You have to understand the pressure he is under, Stella," Grant would say, keeping his voice low and soothing. "He is young, he has incredible drive, but he is still learning the ropes. I need you to have a little more patience with him, guide him. He respects you, even if he does not show it yet." It was a masterclass in soft manipulation. Grant was asking the woman who had saved his company to act as a permanent, unpaid babysitter for a grown man who was actively trying to sabotage her work. He was asking me to absorb his son's professional violence so that the Halverson illusion of competence could remain intact. Those private meetings were the catalyst for my shift in perspective. As I sat across from Grant, listening to him rationalize fraud and gross negligence as youthful exuberance, the reality of my situation crystallized. Wyatt was certainly a dangerous, arrogant obstacle. He was a reckless child playing with heavy machinery. But the true, existential threat to Blackwell urban systems and to my own survival was not the prince. It was the king. Grant Halverson honestly believed he could suspend the laws of cause and effect indefinitely. He believed his wealth and his title gave him the power to delay the consequences of his son's actions forever. He thought he could simply rely on my competence to quietly clean up the blood every time Wyatt swung the knife. He was wrong. A system can only absorb so much poison before it fundamentally breaks down. By protecting his son from the rules that govern the rest of us, Grant was slowly disassembling the very foundation I had spent 7 years building. He was making a calculated gamble that my loyalty to the institution would outweigh my instinct for self-preservation. That was his fatal miscalculation. I was not a loyal servant to the Halverson bloodline. I was a guardian of the system, and if the greatest threat to the system was the family that owned it, then my mandate was absolutely clear. I left his office after one of those patronizing conversations, walked back to my desk, and began to carefully, meticulously outline the architecture of their downfall. The friction shifted from a cold war of passive resistance into a direct, volatile confrontation on a mundane Tuesday afternoon. The catalyst was not a massive structural failure or a lost municipal bid, but a fragile ego violently bruised in a standard cross-departmental review. During the morning strategy session, Wyatt had stood in front of the executive board and projected a 25% quarterly growth margin for the upcoming regional transit expansion. It was a dazzling, aggressive number designed entirely to make him look like an unstoppable visionary to his father and the visiting investors. Evelyn Ross, our head of internal bidding, had simply raised her hand. With the quiet, devastating efficiency of a veteran auditor, she systematically dismantled his entire presentation. She pointed out that global steel shortages and union labor caps meant the physical supply chain could only support a maximum of a 7% increase. She did not mock him. She did not raise her voice. She merely placed the immutable, concrete facts on the boardroom table, exposing his financial fiction in front of the entire senior leadership team. 2 hours later, Wyatt marched into my office, his face a tight mask of barely contained fury, and shoved the heavy glass door completely shut. "I want Evelyn Ross entirely removed from the bidding team by Friday afternoon," he demanded, skipping any form of professional greeting. He paced across the carpet, glaring at the city skyline outside my window as if the buildings had personally offended him. "Terminate her contract. Reassign her to a dead-end desk in compliance. I do not care how you frame it to human resources, but I want her gone." I remained seated behind my desk, resting my hands flat against the cool surface. Evelyn is our lead infrastructure estimator. She is the individual who just locked down the primary operational logistics for the Cedar Vale corridor. That is a $90 million municipal package that we absolutely would have lost without her precision. You cannot fire her. Wyatt stopped pacing and leaned over my desk, planting both hands heavily on the polished wood. "I am the executive vice president of growth. I decide who provides value to this organization." She embarrassed me in front of the managing directors. "She is a bottleneck, and she lacks vision. Her assessment of your quarterly projections was mathematically flawless," I replied, holding his furious gaze with absolute neutrality. "She did her job. She prevented you from submitting a fraudulent, unachievable timeline to the Oversight Committee." His jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. "You are forgetting your place. This department belongs to me now. It operates under my mandate. You have exactly 2 choices here. You either fall in line and execute my orders, or you can start preparing for a very difficult, very short remainder of your career at this firm." The threat was naked, clumsy, and entirely devoid of corporate sophistication. He was a man wielding a sledgehammer because he did not understand how to pick a lock. "A title on a business door does not grant you the right to break the process," I said. My voice was low, devoid of any heat or panic. "You cannot fire an indispensable asset simply because accurate math hurt your feelings." That single sentence severed whatever thin, frayed wire of tolerance still existed between us. He hated me in that moment with a pure, unadulterated intensity. He realized he could not intimidate me into firing Evelyn, and he lacked the unilateral administrative clearance to bypass me and do it himself. Instead of exploding, he abruptly changed tactics. He stood up straight, yanked a thick, aggressively branded folder from his leather briefcase, and dropped it onto my keyboard. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. "Fine," he snapped, his voice dropping to a dangerous, serrated whisper. If you are so utterly committed to doing your job, then do this. Orlean Civic Partners. They are a new, agile, young, and bold subcontracting firm. I want them approved and integrated into the supply chain matrix by tomorrow morning. Push the file through your compliance filter today. Do not ask questions. Do not run it through a multi-week audit. He turned and walked out of my office, leaving the glass door slightly ajar. I spent the next 3 hours dissecting the Orlean Civic Partners dossier. It did not take a forensic accountant to smell the rot. The stench of impropriety rose off the pages almost instantly. The file was a masterclass in corporate camouflage. Wyatt had pitched them as a dynamic, disruptive force in urban development. The reality printed on the pages was a terrifying liability trap. Orlean possessed absolutely no verifiable operational history in heavy municipal infrastructure. Their general liability insurance was capped at a laughable $2 million, which would not even cover the legal retainer fees if a single crane collapsed on a metropolitan worksite. They lacked the heavy machinery fleets required for the scope of the projects they were bidding on, but the most glaring red flag was buried deep within the financial structuring. The primary cost lines looked standard, but the attached appendices were a convoluted labyrinth of administrative surcharges, variable consulting fees, and phantom logistical expenses. These hidden clauses effectively ballooned their total payout by nearly 40% above standard market rate. This was not an agile subcontractor. This was an engineered financial siphon designed to drain project budgets into anonymous pockets. I picked up my office phone and dialed Wyatt's direct extension. He answered on the first ring, clearly waiting for my call. I have reviewed the Orlean file, I stated. They do not meet a single baseline requirement for a Tier 1 vendor. Their insurance is practically non-existent, and the cost structure in Appendix D is wildly inflated. I am denying the approval. I am legally obligated to flag this vendor as a high-risk entity. A heavy, aggravated sigh crackled through the receiver. You are looking at the minor details and missing the entire macro strategy. We need them on the roster to satisfy the diversity and modernization quota for the upcoming state bid. Just push the approval through the system. I cannot approve a vendor that exposes the firm to this magnitude of unmitigated financial and legal risk, I insisted. Listen to me, Wyatt said, his tone dripping with profound condescension. Smart people know when to make the numbers look good first, and fix the reality later. Just sign off on the preliminary integration. We can audit their insurance policies next quarter after the state board hands us the check. He hung up the phone before I could respond. The silence in my office felt heavy, charged with a new, distinct type of danger. The demand regarding Evelyn Ross had been an act of bruised pride. The directive regarding Orlean Civic Partners was an explicit, documented demand to commit corporate fraud on a massive scale. I did not call him back to argue. I did not storm into the executive suite to debate the morality of the situation. Arguing with Wyatt was a pointless exercise in teaching a predator about empathy. He did not care about the physical safety of our work sites, and he certainly did not care about the legal exposure of the firm. Instead, I turned my attention back to my dual monitors. I minimized the active spreadsheets and opened a deeply buried, encrypted partition on my local hard drive. I created a new, unmarked master folder with slow, methodical precision. I began to harvest the raw data. I pulled the complete server logs of his internal communications, isolating every message containing the word Orlean. I saved the time-stamped audio file of the voicemail he had left my assistant demanding the fast-track approval. I dug into the shared network architecture and retrieved the initial, deleted drafts of the Orlean proposal, meticulously comparing them against the sanitized version he had dropped on my desk to highlight the specific risk warnings he had manually erased. I documented the exact hour and minute of every coercive email, every irregular demand, and every attempt to bypass the established legal framework. I even restored a deleted thread where he had explicitly ordered an internal risk assessor to look the other way. This was the exact moment the fundamental nature of the conflict transformed. It was no longer a personality clash between a seasoned executive and a nepotism hire. It was no longer a battle over office politics, bruised egos, or territorial control over a department. It was a silent, absolute war for survival. On one side stood a man who genuinely believed his family name was a magic spell that could bend the laws of finance, physics, and liability to his will. On the other side stood the architect of the system, quietly, invisibly building the gallows out of his own arrogant words. I dragged the final piece of evidence into the encrypted vault, locked the digital drive, and prepared for the bloodbath I knew was inevitable. I did not prepare to win a shouting match in the hallway. I prepared to survive a corporate execution. When a person with immense unearned power realizes you are the only thing standing between them and what they want, they do not negotiate. They eliminate. I understood that my refusal to approve the Oraline Civic Partners file was not just a bureaucratic roadblock. It was a declaration of war. If I was going to survive the inevitable retaliation, I needed more than just a locked folder on my hard drive. I needed to weaponize the very system they were trying to break. My first quiet move was to establish a perimeter with the legal department. I scheduled a brief, undocumented coffee with Nora Bell. Nora was our internal legal counsel, a woman renowned throughout Blackwell for her absolute, unshakable caution. She was the kind of lawyer who saw liability in a sunny weather forecast. I did not walk into her office and declare that the chief executive officer's son was attempting to commit fraud. That would have triggered an automatic, uncontrollable internal investigation that Wyatt would have immediately crushed. Instead, I sat across from her and posed a series of highly technical, deliberately neutral, hypothetical questions. "Nora," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee, "I am reviewing our current boundary lines regarding signature authority. If a Tier 1 executive directive forcefully bypasses the standard compliance matrix on a vendor approval, where does the fiduciary liability legally settle? Does it remain with the executive, or does it cascade down to the departmental director who processed the mandate?" Nora narrowed her eyes slightly, her legal instincts instantly calculating the hidden weight of the question. "Standard indemnification protects the director, provided there is a documented trail of objection," she replied carefully. "If the executive overrides a formal risk flag, they absorb the liability. Why do you ask?" "Stella, are we facing a structural override, just performing a routine stress test of our protocols?" I lied smoothly, giving her a professional smile. "I want to ensure the architecture holds if the pressure increases." Nora did not push further, but she understood the subtext. I had planted the seed. Next, I invited Miles Rowan, the head of internal audit, to review a select handful of recent vendor integration requests. Miles was a man of numbers, entirely devoid of political ambition. I framed the invitation purely under the guise of a process risk assessment. I did not use the word whistleblower. I simply handed him the sanitized versions of Wyatt's demands, alongside the actual operational realities of the subcontractors he was pushing. Miles spent 2 hours looking over the discrepancies. I watched his brow furrow as he traced the inflated margins and the missing insurance parameters. I let the silence stretch, allowing him to discover the anomalies on his own. When he finally looked up, his expression was grave. I had officially placed the scent of blood in front of the auditor. He would start looking closer at the growth division, and he would do it independently of me. As I continued my own deep dive into Oraline Civic Partners, the picture grew infinitely darker. The initial lack of insurance and operational history was just the surface incompetence. The actual structure of Oraline was a masterpiece of corporate parasitism. They were not designed to complete infrastructure projects. They were designed to secure a contract with a low initial bid, only to immediately flood the system with emergency change orders. These change orders were manufactured crises, unexpected soil toxicity, sudden material shortages, rapid weather delays that legally allowed the subcontractor to demand massive, unbudgeted payouts directly from Blackwell's contingency funds. Then came the discovery that elevated the situation from gross negligence to deliberate theft. I spent an entire Friday evening cross-referencing Orleans' obscure corporate registration documents with external financial databases. Deep within a nested web of limited liability companies, I found a definitive link: a highly secretive family trust, historically tied to the exact same boutique investment network Wyatt had bankrupted before joining Blackwell, had recently injected a massive round of seed capital into a legal entity directly partnered with Oraline's founders. I did not have the subpoena power to definitively prove that Wyatt was personally receiving kickbacks. The legal threshold for proving self-dealing was incredibly high. But my intuition, honed over 7 years of hunting corporate ghosts, screamed the truth. This was not a young, arrogant kid trying to show off with a flashy new vendor. This was a sophisticated mechanism engineered to siphon millions of dollars out of Blackwell's municipal contracts and route it back into the Halverson ecosystem. Recognizing the lethal magnitude of this reality, I immediately constructed a 3-tier contingency system. The first tier was my private, encrypted digital vault, which I updated daily with every piece of correspondence, every altered spreadsheet, and every bypassed protocol. The second tier was external. Every 48 hours, I compiled a sanitized but highly detailed summary of the operational risks and securely transmitted it to my personal attorney. It was a legally protected timeline of events, ensuring that if Blackwell attempted to terminate me and confiscate my hardware, the narrative was already established off-site. The third tier was a fail-safe and automated release protocol. I wrote a secure automated script tied directly to my corporate network credentials. If my Active Directory account was ever locked, suspended, or subjected to an irregular administrative password reset, the script would immediately execute. It would package the most damning pieces of evidence: the Orline financial structures, Wyatt's coercive emails, and the proof of the family trust connection, and automatically forward the entire dossier to 3 specific people: Nora Bell, Miles Rowan, and the senior chairperson of the External Oversight Committee. If Wyatt tried to remove me quietly, the system would expose everything immediately. While I was quietly laying these traps, Wyatt grew increasingly emboldened. His emails shifted from demanding to blatantly reckless. He was leaving a paper trail so toxic it practically glowed in the dark. "Remove the red flags on the Orline file immediately," he wrote in one email sent at 2 a.m. "The State Board needs to see a clean integration. We will sign the preliminary agreements now and append the compliance minutes later. Do not delay this." I did not react emotionally. I did not tell him he was breaking the law. I treated every interaction as a deposition. I crafted my replies with absolute robotic precision, ensuring that my words served as an impenetrable shield. "Wyatt," I replied evenly, "as per corporate compliance protocol and federal infrastructure guidelines, I cannot remove a risk flag without the corresponding verified insurance documentation. Appending minutes post-signature constitutes a severe violation of our audit framework. The risk assessment remains active. Please advise if you are formally overriding this compliance block." He never replied in writing to those specific warnings. He would just find another way to push the issue. Every short, standard response I sent was another brick in the wall I was building around myself. But just as I believed my defenses were perfectly aligned, the landscape shifted beneath my feet. It happened on a Wednesday. I was reviewing a finalized quarterly projection deck that I had personally locked down and secured the previous night. When I opened the file, I noticed a subtle discrepancy. A key timeline regarding the Cedar Vale corridor had been shortened by 3 months, magically erasing a massive logistical bottleneck. Wyatt did not have the administrative clearance to edit a locked compliance document. I immediately pulled the back-end access logs to see how he had bypassed the security matrix. The log revealed the digital fingerprint of the edit. It was not Wyatt's user account, and it was not executed from his mobile device or his office terminal. The IP address that forced the override originated from a dedicated, highly secure network node located on the executive suite floor. It was a subnet reserved exclusively for the absolute highest echelon of Blackwell leadership. A cold, heavy dread settled in my stomach. Wyatt was arrogant, but he was not a systems architect. He lacked the technical capability to breach my locked files. Someone else had done it for him. Someone with a level of system authority that superseded my own. As I stared at the glowing IP address on my monitor, the terrifying reality of my situation finally crystallized. Wyatt was not acting alone. He was the blunt instrument, but there was a hand guiding him from the shadows of the executive suite. The corruption was not isolated to a rogue vice president. It was structural. It was authorized from the top. And whoever was helping him had just signaled that they were watching me. The violent spectacle at the Marlowe house was not a spontaneous loss of control. It was the inevitable, engineered detonation of a power pipeline that I had kept forcefully sealed for far too long. As I stood in the quiet, sterile sanctuary of my apartment bathroom later that night, the adrenaline finally began to recede, leaving behind the cold, hard architecture of the truth. Wyatt had chosen that exact moment, in front of the sweeping arched windows and the crystal chandeliers, with absolute predatory calculation. For weeks, I had methodically blocked every illicit shortcut he attempted to carve through the company's infrastructure. I had starved him of the unearned victories he desperately needed to validate his fabricated executive title. The Gala was his perfectly staged arena. He needed to reclaim his dominance, and he needed to do it in front of the investors, the oversight board, and the very people who knew I was the one holding his leash. He had deliberately intercepted my conversation with Dana Whitmore because he understood the brutal geometry of corporate optics. He knew that if he pressured me in front of a critical client, the social contract of the room would bind my hands. If I reacted with appropriate, justified anger, if I raised my voice to match his aggression, the Whisper Network would not condemn him for his demands. They would condemn me for being an uncontrollable, overly emotional woman incapable of handling high-stakes pressure. He had weaponized my professionalism against me. But the public performance masked a darker, far more lethal private ultimatum. The observers in the ballroom had only heard the loud, demanding tone of his voice right before his hand struck my face. They did not hear the venomous, terrifyingly quiet words he had hissed into my ear just seconds prior, his breath hot and reeking of scotch. "If the Oraline transfer is not signed and resting on my desk by tomorrow morning," Wyatt had whispered, his eyes entirely devoid of humanity, "you will no longer have a seat at Blackwell. I will personally see to it that you are erased." Looking at the faint, angry flush of pink spreading across my left cheek in the mirror, the ultimate reality of his objective crystallized. The slap was not just a tantrum over a delayed contract, it was an execution of my agency. Wyatt no longer simply wanted to bypass my compliance framework. He wanted to physically and psychologically break me. He intended to turn me into a bleeding, broken symbol. He wanted every other director, auditor, and manager in the building to look at my public humiliation and understand that challenging the Halverson bloodline resulted in total, unmitigated destruction. He wanted to terrorize the system into permanent submission. I rested my hands on the edge of the porcelain sink and allowed the raw, suffocating wave of profound humiliation to finally wash over me. I let it burn in my chest. I let the sheer, nauseating indignity of being struck like an animal by a lesser man flood my nervous system. I gave myself exactly 3 minutes to feel the absolute depth of the degradation. When the third minute passed, I shut the emotion off like a valve. I walked out of the bathroom, moved into my home office, and opened my laptop. The screen illuminated the dark room. I bypassed the standard network protocols and accessed the encrypted partitions of my 3-tier contingency system. I verified the automated data packets containing the Oraline financial structures, the coercive emails, and the undeniable proof of his family trust connection. The dead man's switch was fully armed and waiting in the shadows. Then, I drafted a direct, unencrypted email to the chief executive officer. I did not attach the full arsenal of evidence. I attached just enough to prove that I was holding the knife. I included the timestamp demands, a summary of the fraudulent margin inflation, and a formal documented account of the physical assault that had just occurred in his presence. I typed the subject line with slow, deliberate keystrokes. You need to see what your son has done and what he has been trying to do. I hit send. The message vanished into the digital ether, bound for Grant Halverson's inbox. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the darkness of my living room, watching the city lights shift and fade as the hours bled into the early morning. I did not cry over the throbbing heat in my cheek. The physical strike was irrelevant. My grief was reserved for a much deeper, far more devastating casualty. I was mourning the final, absolute death of my own corporate idealism. For 7 years, I had labored under the naive, dangerous illusion that if I protected the firm would protect me. I believed that unyielding loyalty to the rules would eventually be rewarded with institutional justice. Staring into the dark, I finally accepted the brutal truth. If I continued to wait for fairness, I would be slaughtered. The only way out was through the fire. The next morning, the sky over the city was a bruised, heavy gray. I walked into the Blackwell Tower at exactly 7 o'clock, my posture rigid, my expression wiped completely clean. As the elevator carried me up to the executive suite, I ran through the 3 strategic scenarios I had spent the entire night mapping out. Scenario 1. Grant would act as the seasoned, responsible leader, horrified by the insurmountable legal liability his son had created, and he would immediately move to protect me and the firm. Scenario 2. Grant would fully embrace his nepotism, aggressively cover for Wyatt, and attempt to intimidate me into silence with threats of termination and industry blacklisting. Scenario 3. Grant would act purely on self-preservation, recognizing the radioactive nature of the situation, and coldly sacrifice both of us to appease the oversight board and maintain the company's market valuation. I was fully prepared to counter every single one of those maneuvers. I was not prepared for the terrifying reality of what Grant actually chose to do. When his assistant ushered me into his sprawling, mahogany-paneled office, Grant was standing by the window. He turned to face me. His expression was not angry, defensive, or panicked. It was a mask of deep, manufactured sorrow. He gestured for me to sit in the heavy leather chair opposite his desk. He did not immediately sit down himself. He walked over, poured a cup of black coffee from a silver carafe, and placed it gently on the desk in front of me. The gesture was sickeningly paternal. "Stella," Grant began, his voice dropping an octave into a register of soothing, resonant empathy. He looked directly at my face, letting his eyes linger for a fraction of a second on the area where his son had struck me, before meeting my gaze with a perfectly calculated look of heavy regret. "I read your preliminary file. I stayed up the entire night reviewing the logs. I want you to know that I hear you. I see the immense burden you have been carrying." He finally sat down, folding his hands resting on the pristine leather blotter. He was a portrait of a wise, weary king managing a tragic internal crisis. "The behavior Wyatt displayed last night was categorically unacceptable," Grant continued, shaking his head slowly. "There is no excuse for a lapse in composure of that magnitude. You are an invaluable architect of this company's success. Your safety and your professional dignity are paramount to me." For a fleeting, dangerous second, the delivery was so flawless I almost believed him. But I remembered the network logs. I remembered the IP address from this exact floor that had secretly bypassed my security protocols to alter the internal bids. He was putting on a masterclass in crisis management, and I was the crisis. He was pretending to validate my trauma. He was acknowledging the assault just enough to make me feel heard, effectively disarming my immediate instinct to fight. But as I watched the microscopic tightening of the muscles around his eyes, I realized the horrifying truth. He had no intention of disciplining Wyatt. He had no intention of investigating the Oraline fraud. Grant Halverson was using this meeting to project an illusion of safety, while his mind was already operating 10 steps ahead. meticulously calculating exactly how to quietly, surgically dump the entire toxic catastrophe onto my shoulders and bury me alive under the wreckage. Grant closed the beige folder. He had spent exactly 4 minutes reading the preliminary summary I had provided. 4 minutes was more than enough time for a man of his intellect to comprehend the devastating legal implications of the vendor manipulation, the altered timestamps, and the documented witness accounts of the assault. He aligned the edges of the paper with the edge of his mahogany desk, a gesture of absolute chilling control. "We need to de-escalate," Grant said. His voice was completely devoid of shock or anger. It was the polished, sterile tone of a man managing a minor public relations inconvenience. "There is no de-escalation available for this scenario, Grant," I replied, keeping my posture rigid. "This has escalated far beyond a standard departmental friction. We are actively looking at document fraud, calculated subcontractor manipulation with Oraline Civic Partners, and your son committing a public, unprovoked physical assault against an executive director." Grant offered a soft, dismissive sigh, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. He was deliberately attempting to shrink the magnitude of the crisis using the power of softened vocabulary. "What happened last night was unfortunate," Grant countered smoothly. "It was an immature reaction in a high-pressure environment. Wyatt is carrying an immense load regarding the municipal transit expansion." He snapped. "It was a lapse in judgment, and I assure you, he will be reprimanded privately. But throwing words around like fraud and manipulation is a dangerous game. Stella, we must not let emotions dictate our corporate strategy." He was trying to sanitize the violence. He was trying to wrap a criminal offense in the comforting corporate language of stress management. "A physical strike is not a lapse in judgment," I stated, my voice dropping to a colder register. "It is an assault. The altered financial margins are not emotional interpretations. They are verifiable liabilities. I am formally requesting Wyatt be placed on immediate suspension, and I am initiating a mandatory, independent review of the entire growth division by an external auditing firm." Grant looked at me for a long, silent moment. The mask of the concerned father vanished, replaced instantly by the ruthless calculus of a corporate survivor. "I cannot allow you to initiate an external audit," Grant said, his tone turning to flat steel. "In fact, given the highly volatile nature of these accusations and your obvious personal distress regarding the incident at the Gala, Human Resources and I have made a joint decision. Effective immediately, you are being placed on paid administrative leave." The air in the room suddenly felt thin, as if the ventilation system had just sucked the oxygen from the space. "Administrative leave," I repeated, the sheer audacity of the maneuver washing over me. "To ensure neutrality," Grant added, not blinking. "We need a cooling-off period. The firm needs to conduct a quiet, internal assessment without the primary parties interfering with the workflow. Your system access will be temporarily suspended, and I must ask for your keycard. This is for your own protection, Stella, so you can recover from the stress of the evening." It was a flawless, terrifying corporate assassination. He was not firing me, which would trigger an immediate wrongful termination lawsuit. He was quarantining me. He was stripping me of my weapons, locking me out of the digital battlefield, and framing my exile as an act of benevolent medical concern. Within 2 hours, the bureaucratic guillotine fell with silent efficiency. As I walked back down to my floor, my phone buzzed with an automated alert. My corporate email account had been locked. My calendar was wiped clean. All my upcoming strategy meetings with municipal clients were instantly deleted from the shared server. By the time I reached my office door, a meticulously vague, company-wide email had already been dispatched from the executive communications team. It announced my temporary leave of absence to focus on my well-being, wishing me a speedy recovery. In the span of one morning, Grant had weaponized the entire corporate structure to make me the problem. He had successfully painted me as the hysterical, overwhelmed woman who needed a break, implicitly absolving his son of any wrongdoing. I pulled an empty cardboard box from the supply closet and began placing my personal items inside. The process was sickeningly quiet. The true horror of corporate betrayal does not come from screaming matches. It comes from the profound, crushing isolation. I stepped out of my office holding the box, walking down the long corridor toward the elevators. The floor was bustling, yet I existed in a sudden, invisible vacuum. Men and women who had stood in my office just 3 days prior, begging me to save their doomed contracts from legal ruin, suddenly found their computer monitors fascinating. A senior project manager I had mentored for 4 years quickly turned the corner to avoid my gaze. The silence of my colleagues was a physical weight. They had read the vague email. They knew Wyatt had struck me. They understood the power dynamics at play, and every single one of them made the silent, cowardly calculation that standing near me was professional suicide. I handed my security badge to the stoic guard in the lobby and walked out into the gray daylight. I was entirely cut off from the system I had spent 7 years protecting. But the moment the Blackwell IT department severed my Active Directory account, they unwittingly pulled the pin on the grenade I had left behind. My 3-tier contingency system detected the irregular administrative lock. The dead man's switch engaged automatically. While I was standing on the pavement hailing a taxi, a highly encrypted, automated script was actively routing through a secure proxy server. It packaged the raw, unsanitized Auraline files, the coercive email chains, and the hidden evidence of the unauthorized document edits. It bypassed the internal corporate firewall entirely and delivered the dossier directly into the private, personal inboxes of Nora Bell and Miles Rowan. I had armed them with the exact data I had deliberately withheld from Grant's preliminary summary. I arrived at my apartment, placed the cardboard box on the kitchen counter, and stared out the window. The waiting game had begun. I did not have to wait long. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my personal cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unknown number, but I recognized the heavy, anxious breathing on the other end the moment I answered. "Stella," Miles Rowan said, his voice a tight, hushed whisper. He sounded like a man who had just discovered a bomb under his desk. "I am calling you from a burner phone. Do you understand?" "I understand, Miles," I replied calmly. "You received the package." "I received it," he confirmed, his voice trembling slightly. "Nora got it too. We are looking at the raw data right now. Stella, you have to listen to me carefully. The situation is drastically worse than what you documented in your summary. Tell me what you found," I instructed. "I ran a deep forensic trace on the Auraline compliance approval," Miles explained, the auditor in him taking over the fear. "You suspected an executive suite IP address bypassed your lock. I dug into the exact user clearance level required to force that specific override. Wyatt does not possess that clearance. Even as an executive vice president, his digital footprint would have bounced off your firewall." I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. "Who opened the file?" "Miles." "The override was executed using a master administrative token," Miles whispered, the sheer weight of the revelation crushing the air out of his lungs. "It is a token issued to exactly one person in the entire Blackwell infrastructure. The chief executive officer, Grant Halverson, personally unlocked the Auraline file. He is the one who altered the margins. He authorized the fraud." The puzzle pieces violently snapped together, forming a picture of absolute corruption. The man sitting behind the mahogany desk had not been merely acting as a protective father cleaning up his son's mess. He was not a passive enabler. Grant Halverson was the primary architect. He had installed his incompetent son as the executive vice president of growth to serve as the perfect, loud, arrogant distraction. Wyatt was the noisy frontline soldier absorbing all the friction and taking all the blame, while Grant quietly manipulated the system from the shadows to siphon millions into their hidden family trust. Grant had not placed me on administrative leave to protect Wyatt. He had exiled me to protect himself. He realized my investigation into Auraline was inches away from exposing his direct involvement. and he had used the Gala assault as the perfect, convenient excuse to eliminate the only threat to his operation. The betrayal was absolute, cold, and meticulously designed. But as I listened to Miles breathe heavily on the other end of the line, a sharp, dangerous clarity settled over me. Grant thought he had successfully buried the truth. He did not realize he had just handed the shovel to the head of his own internal audit department. Nora Bell and Miles Rowan did not schedule a meeting with the chief executive officer. They completely bypassed the executive suite and the standard chain of command. They understood with absolute clarity that if Grant Halverson intercepted the raw data packets, the evidence would be instantly sanitized, aggressively redacted, and buried permanently under a fabricated shield of attorney and client privilege. Instead, they took the automated dossier my dead man switch had successfully delivered and marched straight into a clandestine emergency session with the independent audit committee of the board of directors. A rapid, heavily concealed internal review was immediately launched in the absolute shadows of the corporate hierarchy. The initial forensic findings were significantly worse than even my encrypted files had suggested. As Miles dug deeper into the enterprise resource planning software, he uncovered the exact mechanism Wyatt had used to force the subcontractor integration. Auraline Civic Partners had not just been pushed through the standard vendor queue with missing insurance documents, they had been aggressively fast-tracked using a Tier 1 Emergency Infrastructure Authorization Code. That specific classification was legally reserved exclusively for catastrophic physical failures in the public sector, such as a collapsed highway overpass or a ruptured municipal water main. Using a disaster code to onboard a fraudulent shell company with ties to the Halverson network was not merely a procedural bypass or an internal policy violation. It was a severe, undeniable violation of federal contracting law. Before the audit committee could even fully process the magnitude of the internal fraud, the crisis abruptly mutated into an existential external threat. On a Thursday morning, a formal, legally binding letter arrived via secure courier. It was dispatched directly from Dana Whitmore at the Briar Transit Renewal Authority. Dana had absolutely not forgotten our truncated, tense conversation at the spring gala. Her internal compliance analysts had scrutinized the paperwork and noticed glaring, irreconcilable inconsistencies between the preliminary operational capacities I had verbally assured her of and the aggressively inflated data packets Wyatt had subsequently submitted to their office. Her letter was not a polite, standard inquiry. It was a severe, aggressively worded warning from a highly lucrative municipal partner. The Transit Authority was officially freezing the strategic renewal package, which was valued at tens of millions of dollars, pending a full and completely independent financial review. Dana stated unequivocally that if her team found even a single trace of structural impropriety, they would instantly pull the massive funding package, report the anomalies to the State Oversight Commission, and blacklist Blackwell Urban Systems permanently. The corporate geometry shifted instantly. We were no longer dealing with a bruised ego, a toxic workplace environment, or an internal power struggle. We were staring directly down the barrel of a catastrophic default, a complete collapse of institutional reputation with our primary funders, and the looming terror of an invasive, uncontrollable external audit. 72 hours after I had been marched out of the building carrying a cardboard box, my phone rang. I was formally summoned back to the tower. I was escorted by external security contractors straight to the heavily soundproofed boardroom on the highest floor of the building. The closed-door session with the audit committee and the senior board members was already fiercely underway. The ambient temperature in the room felt freezing, chilled by the massive air conditioning units and the suffocating tension radiating from the mahogany table. I walked into the room. I did not wear the invisible, heavy scars of a woman who had been publicly struck and humiliated. I wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and carried a single unmarked physical binder. I took the designated seat at the far end of the long table. I did not sit down and play the traumatized victim seeking emotional vindication. I assumed the posture of the only person in the entire room who held the complete, unadulterated timeline of their impending ruin. Wyatt was actively pacing on the opposite side of the room, his face flushed, sweating visibly through the collar of his expensive tailored shirt. When the formidable chairperson of the committee pressed him relentlessly on the fabricated Orline margins and the highly suspicious financial links, Wyatt launched into a desperate, wildly unprofessional, and highly emotional defense. He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at me. "She despises the founding family," Wyatt practically shouted, his voice cracking with raw panic as the walls closed in on him. "She has spent 7 years building a suffocating bureaucratic fortress, and she actively sabotages my strategic growth initiatives because she stubbornly refuses to accept the new generation of leadership. She is vindictive, she is insubordinate, and she is deliberately trying to frame me for minor administrative oversights." I did not interrupt his tirade. I did not raise my voice to defend my honor. I merely sat there with my hands clasped over my binder, watching him unravel beneath the weight of his own frantic, empty words. Throughout the entire breakdown, Grant Halverson remained perfectly still in his high-backed leather chair. He was putting on a breathtaking, masterful performance of a heartbroken, deeply disappointed patriarch. He looked at Wyatt with a calculated mixture of profound sorrow and careful professional distance. He was projecting the flawless image of an honorable, ethical corporate leader who had been tragically betrayed by the reckless ambitions of his own flesh and blood. Grant was rapidly positioning himself to survive the blast radius, fully prepared to let his son take the entire lethal fall to protect his own position. The committee chairperson turned her sharp gaze to me, clearly preparing to cross-examine me regarding the allegations of sabotage. Before she could utter a single syllable, Miles Rowan stood up from his chair. He walked deliberately over to the digital projector and connected his heavily encrypted tablet to the main display interface. The narrative of a rogue executive vice president making isolated administrative errors does not align with the forensic network architecture, Miles stated. His voice was completely devoid of any emotion, delivering the facts with the lethal precision of a seasoned auditor. He brought up a highly complex, dense data log on the massive screen behind him. We traced the exact digital timestamp of the fraudulent alterations made to the Orline vendor files. Executive Vice President Wyatt Halverson did not possess the necessary system clearance to execute those specific foundational changes. The expansive boardroom went absolutely, terrifyingly silent. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the projector fan. Miles tapped a key, and a single, glowing red line of data illuminated the projection screen. The edits that fraudulently elevated Orline to a Tier 1 emergency vendor status, bypassing all internal and external compliance checks, were executed using a master administrative network token, Miles explained, turning to face the completely paralyzed board members. That specific, highly restricted network access node is hardwired directly into the office of the Chief Executive Officer. The atmospheric pressure in the boardroom violently shifted. The senior board members, the legal counsel, and the audit committee slowly turned their heads away from my end of the table. They completely stopped looking at Wyatt, who was now frozen in absolute shock. Every single pair of eyes in the room slowly locked onto Grant Halverson. In that singular, devastating moment, the entire corporate dynamic permanently inverted. The board no longer saw me as a disgruntled, problematic employee leveling hysterical accusations against her superiors. They looked across the mahogany table at the Halverson bloodline and saw a massive, coordinated, structural liability that was actively threatening to detonate the entire organization from the inside out. Grant's stoic, disappointed facade cracked. A microscopic twitch disturbed the corner of his left eye. He realized, with sudden, terrifying clarity, that the firewall he had built to protect himself had just burned to the ground. As the deafening, heavy silence stretched across the room, a chilling new realization washed over the collective consciousness of the board. The physical strike at the spring gala was merely a horrific, noisy distraction. Wyatt was nothing more than a loud, violently arrogant pawn on a much larger board. As I watched Grant grip the armrests of his chair, A much darker, far more dangerous question anchored itself in the very center of the crisis. Who had truly designed this lethal game of corporate pillaging? Was it the reckless, entitled son desperately attempting to impress his father? Or was it the silent, calculating father who had intentionally weaponized his own son to silently rob the empire blind? Within 48 hours of that silent, suffocating boardroom session, the first head rolled. Wyatt Halverson was formally asked to submit his resignation from all executive duties. The Internal Communications Department immediately deployed a masterclass in sanitized, sterile corporate vocabulary. An email was dispatched to all 3,000 employees announcing a strategic leadership restructuring to better align with our long-term growth objectives. The broadcast was a perfectly smooth surface of corporate jargon. It contained absolutely zero references to the violent assault at the Marlowe house. It omitted any mention of Oraline Civic Partners, the frozen transit funds, or the severely compromised internal bids. According to the official company narrative, Wyatt was simply transitioning to pursue other independent investment opportunities, leaving behind a legacy of energetic ambition. It was a beautifully engineered lie designed to protect the stock price and appease the oversight committee. Wyatt had been amputated to save the body, but the actual infection remained completely untouched. The very next afternoon, Grant Halverson requested a private meeting with me. We did not meet in the executive suite. He chose a highly exclusive, discreet private dining room at a downtown club, a neutral territory far away from the prying eyes of the legal department. When I arrived, he was already seated. Projecting an aura of exhausted pragmatism, he poured the tea himself, acting every bit the humbled leader ready to make amends. "You have proven your absolute loyalty to the integrity of this firm, Stella," Grant said, sliding a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the mahogany table. The board and I recognize that the previous work environment became undeniably hostile. We want to correct that trajectory. I am prepared to offer you the title of Senior Vice President of Risk and Compliance. Your base compensation will be increased by 40%. You will have direct hiring authority over a significantly expanded department. I looked at the portfolio resting between us. It was a spectacular, incredibly lucrative offer. To any outside observer, it was the ultimate vindication. I had slain the arrogant prince, and the king was now handing me the keys to the armory. "That is a substantial elevation in scope," I replied, my voice carefully neutral. I did not reach out to touch the leather folder. "What are the structural expectations that accompany this new title?" Grant offered a soft, conciliatory smile. "We simply need to close this unfortunate chapter and move forward securely. The municipal partners are watching us closely. The contract in that folder includes a comprehensive, retroactive non-disclosure agreement regarding the events leading up to the gala. It is a standard protective measure for the firm. We cannot have a senior vice president actively litigating the past while trying to build the future." It was a gilded cage, constructed with flawless legal precision. Grant was not rewarding my competence. He was attempting to purchase my silence. He knew my reputation with the transit authorities was the only asset capable of unfreezing the massive municipal funds. He intended to use my face and my credibility to restore external trust, while simultaneously locking me inside a heavy velvet-lined box where I could never again reference the foundational rot I had uncovered. "I will need my independent counsel to review the terms over the weekend," I told him, finally placing my hand flat on the portfolio. I did not say yes, and I absolutely did not say no. I needed to see exactly how deep the trap was set. Grant nodded smoothly, though a micro-expression of impatience briefly hardened his jaw. "Take all the time you need. Stella, I am confident you will see this is the best path forward for everyone." When I returned to my apartment that evening, I poured myself a single glass of water and spread the settlement documents across my dining table. I bypassed the dazzling compensation figures and the impressive title definitions, hunting exclusively for the structural mechanisms hidden in the fine print. I found the poison pill buried deep within Section 8, under a vaguely titled clause regarding data architecture continuity. The clause explicitly mandated that upon my acceptance of the new role, all server logs, compliance drafts, and back-end digital access records originating prior to the date of the Spring Gala would be permanently sealed under executive privilege. No internal auditor would be permitted to access that historical data without the direct written authorization of the Chief Executive Officer. The realization was cold and absolute. Grant was perfectly willing to sacrifice Wyatt. He was perfectly willing to pay me $500,000 a year to act as his compliance figurehead, but he was utterly terrified of the master administrative network token. He needed me to voluntarily sign away my legal right to ever look at that executive IP address again. As I sat there digesting the sheer audacity of his legal maneuver, a heavy knock echoed from my front door. I walked over and looked through the peephole. The hallway was completely empty. When I opened the door, I found a plain, unmarked manila envelope resting on the floor mat. I brought it inside, broke the seal, and slid the contents onto the table. It was a single sheet of paper. It was a photocopied, handwritten page of meeting minutes. The handwriting was sharp, meticulous, and instantly recognizable. It belonged to the former executive secretary of the board, a woman who had abruptly taken early retirement 2 months prior. The notes detailed a closed-door strategy session between Grant and Wyatt that had taken place long before the conflict over Oraline Civic Partners had fully erupted. I read the specific transcribed quote halfway down the page. Grant had been advising his son on how to handle my continuous blockades of their inflated projections. Grant had stated, "Stella will either sign the integration documents, or she will be isolated, starved of resources, and publicly undermined until she has to leave the firm on her own. You do not break the process, Wyatt. You break the person guarding it." I read the sentence 3 times. The faint, lingering phantom heat of the slap on my cheek suddenly felt entirely irrelevant. Until this exact moment, a small, stubborn part of my corporate conditioning had desperately wanted to believe that Wyatt was simply a catastrophic anomaly. I had wanted to believe that Grant was merely a weak father who had lost control of a reckless heir. This single piece of paper obliterated that naive comfort entirely. Wyatt was not an error in the system. Wyatt was the precise, intended product of his father. Grant had actively mentored his son in the dark arts of psychological corporate warfare. Grant had taught him that compliance was a myth, that rules were meant only for subordinates, and that brute force and isolation were the correct tools to manage uncooperative employees. Wyatt had humiliated me because his father had given him the unspoken structural permission to see me as an object that needed to be broken. I carefully folded the photocopied page and placed it next to the multi-million-dollar settlement offer. The contrast was physically nauseating. I made my decision in the absolute, silent stillness of my apartment. I would not accept the title of Senior Vice President. I would not sign the non-disclosure agreement. I would not allow myself to be absorbed back into a toxic architecture just to serve as a human shield for a corrupt king. Grant believed he could manage me with a combination of money, a fancy office, and an ironclad gag order. He believed he had already won the war by offering me a surrender wrapped in gold. My vendetta was no longer about the public humiliation in the ballroom. It was no longer about ensuring a spoiled young man lost his job. Wyatt was already gone, discarded by the very man who had weaponized him. My target shifted upward. I was going to return to Blackwell Urban Systems, but I would not do it on Grant Halverson's terms. I would only return when my conditions were integrated directly into the foundational bylaws of the corporation itself. I was no longer fighting to win an argument or to protect a single municipal contract. I was preparing to dismantle the exact mechanism of power that had created the Halverson dynasty. When Grant Halverson realized I was not going to quietly accept the gilded cage and the massive pay increase, his strategy immediately shifted from containment to character assassination. He did not launch a public attack. He operated entirely in the shadows, executing a meticulously crafted whisper campaign designed to soften my reputation and erode my credibility within the boardroom. Over the course of 5 days, highly placed proxies began making discreet phone calls to the independent directors. The narrative was subtly rewritten. I was no longer the brilliant, indispensable architect of corporate compliance. Suddenly, I was described as overly emotional and fundamentally difficult to work with. They seeded the toxic idea that I had deliberately exaggerated a standard internal conflict with his son purely to orchestrate a ruthless power grab. The timing of his smear campaign was devastatingly precise. We were exactly 14 days away from a massive, comprehensive evaluation cycle with the primary funding syndicate that bankrolled our largest urban infrastructure initiatives. This supervisory group controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in capital. If they caught wind of a protracted, bloody civil war within the executive suite, they would instantly slash our corporate valuation or pull their financial backing entirely. The board of directors, utterly terrified by the prospect of total financial ruin, began to waver. The righteous anger they had displayed when confronted with the altered network logs started to dissolve into a desperate, cowardly desire for immediate stability. Sensing their panic, Grant pushed a perfectly tailored compromise onto the table. It was a masterpiece of corporate survival. He proposed a finalized structure where Wyatt remained permanently exiled from the firm, completely satisfying the board's demand for accountability. In exchange, I would be reinstated immediately, but only in an acting, interim executive capacity to oversee the damage control. The vital linchpin of his proposal, however, was his own position. Grant argued passionately that he absolutely must retain his seat as chief executive officer to guarantee strategic continuity and project confidence for the funding syndicate during the volatile transition period. Through the lens of my experience salvaging dozens of doomed contracts, I saw the trap with crystalline clarity. If I accepted that compromise, I would be doing exactly what I had always done, cleaning up the catastrophic wreckage created by the Halverson family. I would act as his highly competent janitor, restoring faith with the municipal partners and the financiers, while Grant retained his absolute grip on the dynasty and the ultimate power. Once the funding was fully secured and the crisis faded from memory, my interim title would quietly expire, and he would easily replace me with someone far more compliant. I was completely cornered. The board was ready to eagerly accept his compromise to save the company's valuation, and my refusal would only validate his insidious rumor that I was an irrational, power-hungry rogue employee holding the firm hostage. Then, Nora Bell walked into my apartment on a rainy Tuesday evening and handed me the final, lethal weapon. She bypassed any formal greeting, dropping a thin, heavily secured file onto my kitchen counter. It was not an internal Blackwell document. It was a formal compliance certification mandated by the external funding syndicate, a legally binding guarantee that all internal auditing processes and vendor vetting protocols were fully intact, accurate, and functioning without any executive interference. "Look at the signature line," Nora instructed, her voice tight with a potent mixture of fear and profound triumph. "And then look at the date." I scanned the heavy cardstock. At the absolute bottom of the page, beneath a dense paragraph swearing to the integrity of our risk management framework, was Grant Halverson's distinct signature. I shifted my eyes to the digital date stamped next to his name. The breath caught sharply in my throat. He had signed and submitted this legally binding guarantee to the external financiers on the exact same Tuesday that I had been flooding his private inbox with urgent, documented warnings regarding the Oraline Civic Partners fraud. This single piece of paper entirely obliterated his final line of defense. Grant could no longer claim he was an ignorant executive who had been tragically deceived by his reckless son. He could no longer blame administrative oversight or a breakdown in communication. He had formally, legally certified the absolute safety of the entire corporate vehicle, while actively holding the very directives that were stripping the brakes. He had committed direct documented fraud against the people holding the money. "We do not release this immediately," I told Nora, my mind rapidly assembling the exact architecture of his destruction. "If we hand this to the board right now, Grant will deploy his massive legal team to bury it in procedural technicalities and delay tactics. We have to trap him in a room with the financiers. We have to let him lock the door himself. Over the next 48 hours, Nora, Miles Rowan, and I worked in absolute secrecy to build an irrefutable, chronological sequence of events. We did not rely on emotional appeals, character judgments, or subjective interpretations of corporate policy. We built a timeline out of pure concrete. We started with the initial coercive emails from Wyatt, demanding the fraudulent margin increases. We layered in the undeniable network access logs, proving Grant had personally unlocked the restricted files from the executive suite to force the subcontractor integration. We placed the newly discovered fraudulent funding certification at the exact center of the timeline, proving the chief executive officer's active deception of the investors. We followed it with the severe warning letter from Dana Whitmore, demonstrating the immediate and catastrophic financial fallout. Only at the very end of this devastating sequence did we place the documented evidence of the physical violence at the spring gala. By structuring the dossier this way, the slap was no longer the emotional centerpiece of a standard human resources complaint. It was the brutal, desperate punctuation mark at the end of a massive, coordinated corporate cover-up. It was the physical manifestation of a corrupt system violently lashing out because its fraud had finally been cornered. The night before the final, mandatory joint session between the Blackwell Board of Directors and the Supervisory Funding Syndicate, I sat alone in the dark of my living room. The thick, finalized binder rested on the glass coffee table in front of me. The silence of the apartment was absolute, pressing heavily against my eardrums. I understood the terrifying gravity of what was about to happen the following morning. The people sitting in that room controlled my entire professional existence. If my delivery faltered, if Grant managed to successfully spin the narrative one final time using his undeniable charisma, the board would undoubtedly side with the man who owned the company. I would lose the career I had painstakingly built over 7 grueling years. I would be permanently blacklisted across the entire American Midwest, branded as a toxic, unstable whistleblower who had tried to destroy a legacy out of pure spite. But if the architecture held, if the concrete sequence of facts did its job without a single crack, I was going to trigger the silent, absolute collapse of the Halverson dynasty. When the sun finally rose, casting long, sharp shadows across the city skyline, I picked up the binder. I arrived at the Blackwell Tower, completely bypassed the whispering crowds in the lobby, and took the private elevator up to the executive floor. My pulse was a slow, perfectly steady rhythm against my wrists. I reached the heavy mahogany doors of the main boardroom, took one final, perfectly measured breath, and stepped inside. The joint session convened at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning inside the primary executive boardroom. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, heavy with the silent calculations of the external funding syndicate, who sat completely stone-faced on one side of the massive mahogany table. On the other side sat our board of directors, radiating a nervous, desperate energy. Grant Halverson stood at the head of the table, impeccably dressed, projecting his signature aura of unshakable authority. He had clearly rehearsed his opening maneuver to absolute perfection. "We are navigating a period of inevitable growing pains," Grant began, his voice a smooth, resonant baritone that filled the room. "What you have observed in recent weeks is not a structural failure, but a clumsy, passionate transition between the old guard and the new generation of leadership. Wyatt pushed boundaries too aggressively in his pursuit of growth. We have acknowledged that. He has stepped down. Moving forward, I am implementing a comprehensive stabilization plan, guided by my continued oversight, to ensure our strategic continuity remains perfectly intact." He gestured toward my seat at the far end of the table, offering a patronizing, benevolent smile. He was attempting to publicly lock me into the interim role right in front of the financiers, using their presence to force my compliance. I did not return his smile. I did not stand up and deliver an emotional monologue about fairness or workplace hostility. I simply reached out and opened the heavy, unmarked binder resting in front of me. I slid the first designated packet of documents down the polished wood toward the lead representative of the funding syndicate. There is no stabilization plan, I stated. My voice was completely level, stripping all the heat from the room and replacing it with absolute freezing concrete. There is only a meticulously documented timeline of corporate fraud, orchestrated directly from the office of the Chief Executive Officer. Grant's benevolent smile vanished instantly. The lead financier picked up the packet, his eyes darting down to the first page. Exhibit A, I continued, guiding the room through the architecture of their ruin. This is a comprehensive compilation of server access logs and internal communications. It details exactly how Executive Vice President Wyatt Halverson bypassed mandatory compliance protocols, manually erased risk warnings, and forced an unvetted shell company named Orleans Civic Partners into our Tier 1 infrastructure pipeline. As you will see on page 4, this was done to secure fraudulent margins on projects funded directly by your capital. A sharp collective intake of breath swept through the syndicate members. Grant opened his mouth to object, to deploy his legal counsel, but I did not afford him a single second of oxygen. I slid the second packet down the table. Exhibit B, I said, my pace deliberate and unyielding. This is formal correspondence received from the Briar Transit Renewal Authority. They have independently detected the unverified margins submitted by the Growth Division. They have formally stated that if the Oraline integrations proceed, they will initiate a total freeze on $90 million in municipal capital and report Blackwell Urban Systems for severe contract violations. The reckless directives issued by the executive suite have actively triggered a catastrophic breach of our primary municipal commitments. The board of directors began to physically panic. A senior member gripped the edge of the table, his face turning an ashen shade of gray. Grant gripped his podium, the polished veneer of the untouchable patriarch finally cracking into raw, naked desperation. He realized he could not charm his way out of written evidence in front of the men who held the purse strings. These are the actions of a rogue junior executive, Grant interrupted, his voice raising an octave, desperately attempting to throw his son onto the tracks one final time. I was not made aware of the granular technical overrides until the audit committee intervened. That brings us to the final exhibit, I replied seamlessly, sliding the third and thinnest folder directly to the center of the table. The certification of ignorance. The lead financier opened the final folder. I watched his eyes scan the top document. What you are looking at is the external funding certification guaranteeing the integrity of our vendor vetting process, I explained, letting every single word land like a hammer blow. Notice the signature at the bottom. Notice the date. Grant Halverson personally signed and submitted that legally binding guarantee of compliance to your syndicate on the exact same Tuesday that my department furnished his private inbox with highly classified warnings regarding the Oraline fraud. He did not miss the warnings. He actively buried them. I paused for exactly 2 seconds, allowing the magnitude of the perjury to settle into their minds, before delivering the killing stroke. Directly beneath that certification, I concluded, you will find a handwritten transcript of a closed strategy meeting from 2 months ago. It details the chief executive officer explicitly instructing his son to systematically isolate, sabotage, and break the personnel guarding the compliance framework until they were forced to resign. Grant Halverson knew exactly what his son was doing. He engineered the environment that allowed it to happen. The boardroom instantly plunged into a dead, absolute silence. It was the same stunned silence that had fallen over the Marlowe House ballroom on the night of the spring gala. But this time, I was not the one standing in the center of the room, burning with public humiliation. This time, everyone in that boardroom was staring directly at the Halverson family. They did not see royalty anymore. They saw a family that had become a direct financial threat. The syndicate members looked at Grant with open contempt. The execution was swift and utterly merciless. The funding syndicate demanded an immediate leadership purge, or they would pull their capital by the end of the business day. The board of directors held an emergency, binding vote right there in the room. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the empire was dismantled. Wyatt was permanently legally barred from ever holding an executive or advisory role within the Blackwell infrastructure. Grant Halverson was brutally stripped of his title as Chief Executive Officer and entirely stripped of his power to appoint any family members to the operational board. The entire approval matrix was ordered to be rebuilt under strict, independent external oversight. Later that evening, the panicked board practically begged me to take the helm and restore faith with the transit authorities. I did not accept their desperate offers of temporary power. I only agreed to return when they drafted a legally binding, permanent contract that included 3 non-negotiable structural clauses. First, a strict anti-nepotism mandate governing the entire executive level. Second, the routing of all internal audit reports directly to the independent board, completely bypassing the chief executive suite. Third, absolute, autonomous human resources control for the compliance department, ensuring that no executive could ever again threaten a risk assessor's career for telling the truth. I forced them to write the rules of my victory into the very DNA of the company. Exactly 1 year later, I returned to Marlowe House for the annual Spring Gala. The string quartet played the same sweeping melodies, and the crystal chandeliers cast the same fractured golden light across the opulent ballroom. I walked in wearing a deep emerald gown, attending not as a defensive barrier, but as the formally appointed Chief Operating Officer of Blackwell Urban Systems. I walked directly past the exact spot near the arched windows where I had been struck 12 months prior. I did not pause. I did not look back at the marble floor for long. My revenge was never about shouting in a boardroom or making an arrogant boy feel small in front of a crowd. It was about surgically removing the corrupt architecture that allowed him to exist, and forcing an entire corporation to finally run on actual merit instead of toxic inherited blood. Wyatt genuinely believed that the slap that night was the ultimate demonstration of his power. The exact moment he ended Stella Baker. He never realized that striking me was simply the stupidest, most fatal signature he had ever placed on the absolute destruction of his own family's empire. Thank you for listening to the story. Please comment below and let me know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, be sure to subscribe to Boss Revenge Stories, like the video, and hit the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.